being able to look behind the curtain at Bethel and sort of question their claims of being God's spokesman or faithful and discreet slave, you had time to think about these things. I remember one of the things that was sort of impactful for me is when I considered they teach that they were part of a long line of faithful servants, faithful and discreet slave, responsible for spiritual food going all the way back to the time of the apostles.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to Ramacrow. Every now and then I get to welcome back to the channel individuals who I've interviewed in the past who know something about the Jehovah's Witness religion, which I used to be a member of. And today I get to do this with William Morgan. Welcome back, William.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
So the last time you and I were together, we were sat in a field being eaten alive by an array of insects that are native to Croatia. And you were telling a fascinating story related to toxic waste. And if Tibor is gracious, a thumbnail to that interview will appear. You're not here today to talk about toxic waste, but would it be fair to say that, that interview was a positive experience in terms of people kind of reaching out to you?
Yes. Yeah, it was. It was, it was definitely something that was impactful for me as an event. And then since that interview, several people have commented on that. And, that it was just one more sort of nail in the coffin for, their beliefs and whether or not this organization was directed by God or not. Again, it just sort of paints a picture of a man-made organization. So a lot of people, they looked at that interview and thought that as well.
Sure. And, bear in mind, there will be people who see that thumbnail. The title again is I Blew the Whistle on Toxic Waste at Wallkill. And they'll be like, whoa, hang on a minute now. I want to hear about that. Well, right. The objective in having you back is not to kind of rake over all of that all over again, because, we went into it in some detail. So viewers, if you want to learn more about that and William's specific experience with the mismanagement of toxic waste at Wallkill by the Watchtower Society, please do check out that video. But today, if it's okay, William, I want to kind of revisit your personal journey that led to you becoming a Jehovah's Witness, and then explore how you managed to deprogram yourself. So if that's okay, how did you first come across Jehovah's Witnesses?
My parents started studying when I was a teenager, around 13, if I recall correctly. And through that time period, I was already starting to develop my own thoughts and my own objectives in life and goals. And it never stuck with me, but I had exposure to that. I mean, we were forced to go to all the meetings and have studies and service as well. So, it sort of paved the way for later on in life. And when I was 22 or 23, and I started to take up the topic of religion for myself, and finally start to think about it, I obviously had that in the background. So, and in addition to that, my parents were sort of soft shunning me when I left, not having been baptized and not really participating in, with Jehovah's Witnesses. They were sort of soft shunning me. So as I began to study religion again, all of that went away, and it just became a very easy thing to be sympathetic towards. And that kind of led me down the path.
When you say soft shunning, what does soft shunning look like? Because, it's easy to say it, but, I think any form of shunning, leaves its mark on someone, So what did that look like in real terms?
Well, technically, treating a disfellowship, you shun someone who is disfellowshipped or disassociated. But there are, in my experience, there are other levels of shunning, such as if you're bad association, and a family member who has nothing to do with Jehovah's Witnesses can experience that. In fact, I remember my grandparents. They noticed the separation that occurred just from my parents going and studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. But back to my case, when I graduated high school and I just walked away from, I didn't get baptized and I didn't take up the religion like my parents had wanted, there's always this cloud of disapproval. And I just felt association was limited. It wasn't as harsh as if someone was disfellowshipped, but I could still very much sense the disapproval and the distance that was created.
And don't we all crave, particularly when we're younger, to some degree, the approval of our parents? So, the very fact that you kind of experience this cloud of disapproval kind of hints very strongly at how things operate in the organization, because it's all supposed to be your personal decision, isn't it, to get dedicated and baptized? But if you're effectively being pressured because you'll have the disapproval of your parents if you don't pursue the religion, immediately it becomes less of a choice.
Right. And I think the younger you are when you're exposed to that sort of pressure, that expectation, the more susceptible you are to being drawn into it. I'm reminded, so I was 13 and it didn't really take with me or my older sister, but my younger sister was 3 years younger than me. And it did. She's a Jehovah's Witness today. And I have a feeling that part of her, part of the reason is she was just brought into it at a younger age than us.
Sure. So you had this soft shunning, as you describe, and this cloud of disapproval. And what were your first kind of tentative steps? So presumably you agreed to a Bible study.
Yes, I did. I was, it was at the suggestion, I believe, of my father that I start a Bible study. And I can't remember the details, but I think he may have even helped orchestrate who that was and like that. I was working several states away. It was in Michigan. I had a nice older couple studied the Bible with me. And I wasn't completely convinced that Jehovah's Witnesses had the truth. So I was open to other ideas. And, there's a very interesting episode that I clearly remember that became relevant when I was in Bethel. And that is, I was dating a worldly girl at the time, and she had a friend who knew about Jehovah's Witnesses and provided me with a book. I believe it wasn't written by a former Jehovah's Witness, but I think it was perhaps a Baptist source or some sort of source that exposed essentially the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, the inconsistencies of teachings, and some of the scandals in the past. And so I was exposed to that while I was studying. And I got to be honest, the things I was reading it was so sensational to me, and it was so completely foreign to what I knew about Jehovah's Witnesses that when I approached my Bible study conductor, and my Bible study conductor says, apostates lie, they just want to draw you away from the religion, and essentially convincing me to ignore this information, I was able to believe it because, the history of the organization is incredible. I mean, I can absolutely see why they do not want you to look into it. It clearly paints a picture of an organization that's contrived by men.
But it's also interesting that you seem to have encountered a publication, and there are many, so I'm not surprised that you can't remember exactly which one, but you came across a publication that seems to have taken a sensationalist tone. And I can definitely relate to that. When I was first taking my tentative steps into kind of the world of quote unquote apostasy, I was absolutely terrified of absorbing in essentially lies. And I was very, very obsessive about, where's this information coming from? I remember coming across JW Facts, and before reading anything, I wanted to know who was behind the website. I went to the page where Paul Grundy had a picture of him with his son. And as soon as I saw that photograph, I thought, okay, he looks sort of normal. I think I can listen to what he has to say. It's funny how our minds work, isn't it? So your initial impression of quote unquote apostate material almost kind of, would it be fair to say it kind of fit with the stereotype of what you were being warned about?
Well, when I say it was sensational, it was aspects about the Watchtower Society that I had no idea about. Things like, did you know that there was a scandal of Miracle Week that was turned into a court case where Pastor Russell lost? That's sensational. I never knew about that.
So it wasn't sensationalist in tone. It was just the information itself was shocking. Okay.
Exactly. And completely different from the prepackaged information that we received from the Watchtower Society. It's completely foreign. So it just shocked me, and it was very easy to believe my study conductor when he said, "Oh no, they're just apostate lies."
Although it's an odd lie to come up with, isn't it? What lie can we really get them with? I know, Miracle Week. You'd surely think of something more convincing than that, wouldn't you?
Right.
Like, they kill babies or something, which isn't far from the truth. So, okay. So you pressed on with the study. Can you remember which publication you were studying?
It was the Red Live Forever book.
Enjoy Life on Earth Forever. Okay.
No, I think it was one before that. Oh, yes. Enjoy Life Forever. Sorry. Yeah.
That's the one I studied before I got baptized. Yeah. So you and I were both sold on the generation teaching.
Yes.
Which the organization, which we were baptized on, or I was baptized on, and obviously the organization was able to kind of just distance itself from. But and
it's interesting that how pivotal that teaching was too in my waking up process. So a little story about my time in Bethel. When I was there, that's when we had that change about the generation. And at the time, prior to that, you could go into the press room and they would have Bethel tours and you could see how the presses work. Well, during that period, they roped them off and they didn't want anyone to be able to casually wander into the press room. And the reason for this was they didn't want, when you first do a run of
the masthead on the Awake.
Yeah, well, the entire magazine, when they first dial in the presses, you get these discarded copies that aren't quite make the QC. So you could pick it up and you could read you're gonna study in about 6 or 8 weeks from then. So it's like an early preview, and they didn't want either Bethelites or people on the Bethel tour to be able to pick up a magazine and read this important new light. They wanted everyone to read it when they received it in the mail. Wow.
Okay. I did not know that.
Yeah. So that there was this secrecy, and only the pressmen were allowed in the press room. And I remember fast forward 2 months, I think it was the district conventions. I was in Ohio, and with the idea of the teaching that the faithful and discreet slave, which at that time was all of the anointed, is in charge of providing spiritual food to mankind. With that in mind, I was able to talk to some anointed ones who were sitting in a section of the district convention. And I just asked them, I said, did you have any input into the generation change? And I asked 3 of them, I recall. And they all said, oh, no, we read about it when we received it in the mail, like everyone else. And so that event there told me that they're teaching that the faithful and discreet slave, which at that time was the scattered older anointed ones in the congregations around the world, were responsible for spiritual food. That was clearly not the case. They had nothing to do with this new light. It came from the writing department. They received it like everyone else. So that to me told me that this teaching is clearly not true.
And that remained the teaching right up to 2012, because I can remember I was already awake by that point when they switched to saying, okay, the governing body is the faithful and discreet slave, rather than, and I'd better explain it because there will be people watching this interview who don't understand what we're talking about. So the previous teaching used to be that any Jehovah's Witness who considered themselves to be of the 144,000 who rule in heaven are part of, quote unquote, the faithful and discreet slave. And the governing body were the representatives of this larger faithful and discreet slave. So therefore, anything that gets printed in the literature is essentially representative of what the faithful and discreet slave have kind of agreed upon. That's kind of at least the assumption you get when you use the word representative. But then in 2012, they changed the teaching so that rather than anyone who claimed to go to heaven being of this faithful and discreet slave, it was literally just the governing body who got to make that claim. So, yeah, that's when it changed. Okay, wow. So can I drag you back to
Please do.
this Bible study in the Enjoy Life Forever book? So how do you go from studying the Enjoy Life Forever book to being in Bethel?
Well, it just seemed like, there was this welcome back to the family feeling that I got from my parents. Once you sort of engage with the study program, it's kind of, there's just there's support for you to progress in the religion. So I studied, I got baptized. I was working at the time on a contract that was set to end. So I didn't look for employment after my contract period. I was able to do some pioneering, and then I applied and got asked to serve at Bethel. So that's a very quick summary, but I'd say that all happened within the span of 3.5 to 4 years. So studying, baptized, getting asked to go to Bethel.
That would have been, you would have been pioneering pre-1998. So you would have been doing 90 hours a month? Yes. Now,
I'm sorry, but I can't remember if I was auxiliary pioneering or regular.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay. It might have been auxiliary. Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. I think, how many was it for auxiliary? I think it might have been,
60.
Was it 60 for auxiliary? And nowadays it's, of course, 50 for regular. So you were doing more than a regular pioneer is today back then. Wow. Okay. So like you say, a fairly quick process of working in Bethel. And, we've been through in a previous interview, the situation with the toxic waste and, the impact that had on you. How would you sum up life as a Bethelite, and what impact did it have on your kind of journey in terms of understanding things in perspective?
I refer to it as the hamster wheel. It seems like the Watchtower Society wants you busy at all times. And that is never more true than at Bethel. I remember managing my time in 15-minute increments. You had all sorts of Bethel related duties, congregational obligations. You had very, very little free time. So that was sort of the environment that I was in, but it also provided me an opportunity to, look at what God's organization is. I went in there expecting to see something exceptional. And I kept, asking myself, is this something that would be an organization run by God, or is this just man-made? I would often make that comparison. I was expecting to see wonderful, wonderful things. And what I found there was very much human.
Yeah. Can you remind me how long you were in Bethel for?
About 6 years. 6 years.
Okay. Well, that's a long time. And, obviously, again, I'm anticipating the fact that many viewers won't maybe even know what Bethel is. So, we're talking about the facilities that Jehovah's Witnesses use to essentially print their literature and manage the organization worldwide. And in the time when you were a Bethelite, Bethel, incidentally, means house of God. And it's interesting, I've only just kind of recently, the pennies dropped. The name Bethel, house of God, is talking about El, the god El, who was an actual god back in the days when worship of God was polytheistic. But anyway, so you were in Bethel, and there were at the time 3 main facilities. There was Brooklyn, where the governing body were headquartered. There was the Patterson Education Center, which I think opened up in the 90s at some point. And there was also Wallkill, which was it used to be called Watchtower Farms, I think.
Right.
And it was also where the bulk of the printing got done. And nowadays, Wallkill is, I think, referred to as the United States branch. So you were in Bethel, but you weren't in close proximity to, let's say, the governing body. Would that be fair?
Right. We did have a sort of morning worship was telecast through to us. So they were in Brooklyn, but we'd see them during morning worship, but that was about it. Other than when they made tours, we didn't.
But the morning worships, I mean, now we get to see at least a few morning worships on JW Broadcasting and on the website. Yeah. And, even kind of the, shall we say, the curated morning worships that they've chosen, they can be pretty odd at times. So with a no more, and you were getting like one every day. So were there no morning worships where you were like, I can't believe what that guy just said?
Yeah, I don't think they've quite adjusted to the fact that they're broadcasting to the world now, because you definitely saw that they felt free to truly express themselves, not whitewash their words like we see so often. So there's different rants by Carl. Anyway, and keep this in mind. You wake up early in the morning, you go to your table where you're going to eat your breakfast. You haven't had your coffee, you're hungry, and you're just waking up. And you have to listen to the morning worship section before any of this happens. So you're sort of half awake, but every now and then you're like, oh, that sounded odd.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
you're still waking up at that point, aren't you? And I wasn't a Bethelite, but I did visit Bethel a few times and even stayed over. And so I remember the experience of going to a morning worship. And we also had morning worship when I was at MTS, which was for 8 weeks. So I feel like I kind of understand what morning worships are. And so you're essentially assembling table by table, and each table has a table head. And like you say, you're turning up and you've got, the whiff of food, and maybe there's even some food on the table, but you're not allowed to eat it until you've listened to this essentially speech or series of speeches. And I can imagine it, especially if you're still kind of coming around because you're exhausted. It must be an odd environment to be taking in, like you say, the occasional rant from a governing body member who's not happy with something. Yeah.
Right. And the more exposure you have to that, the more you sort of, you're going in there with the assumption that, okay, this is directed by Jehovah. But the more exposure you have, it gets you to sort of wonder about that claim. That's a bold claim. And yet you're seeing, everything you're seeing, it provides ample opportunities to doubt that claim.
So aside from the toxic waste, are there any kind of stories that kind of stick in your mind? And it doesn't have to be anything kind of revelatory, but were there any kind of, funny anecdotes, that you can remember from your 6 years in Wallkill that just give us a flavor of what life was like?
What life was like. All right. So I remember I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 other guys.
Hang on a minute.
Right.
1 bedroom.
1 bedroom.
Shared with 4. We were all in the same bed.
Right. And, now I understand why they had Pillowgate. Okay, go on. Yeah. And so it had great, interesting personalities. We all found a way to enjoy ourselves while we were in sort of a pressure cooker environment. One thing I remember, going back to what I related to you about, sort of reading sensational information about the society, the Watchtower Society and its past. I didn't really believe it. It was easy to cast it off, but I still wondered. And so while at Bethel, they have the Bethel library there. And in that time, the internet was not really as prolific as it is now. So
by the way, I often fantasize about the Bethel library. As a collector of Watchtower materials, I would love to be let loose in there one day.
Right.
With maybe while someone's back's turned, anyway, go on.
Yeah. And so that was the only way to get information. Like if you wanted to read a magazine back, that was printed in 1901, you either have to rely on some reprint in an apostate book, which you're going to doubt. But now here I had the opportunity to go to the source. And you could read every single piece of literature that was ever printed in the Bethel Library. And I remember some of the more, sensational things I read, like Miracle Wheat, like some of the Declaration of Facts in the 1934 yearbook, where they're cozying up to the Nazi regime. That was sensational. I was able to look it up, and it was interesting that when I went to look those things up, I'd open up the 1934 yearbook and I'd see little faint pencil lines where someone else had took note of that. Some of the dates where they predicted Armageddon, I could see, you could just see someone else was there looking at this.
Someone else has been here collecting the breadcrumbs. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So, and that's
what effect did that have on you though? Because, you mentioned before, when you were first exposed to these ideas, they were kind of dismissed as sensational, but now you're actually in the house of God, quote unquote, and you're looking in their own literature and you're seeing it there in black and white. So was there no kind of epiphany? Oh, actually, what am I doing here? The apostates were right.
Well, it was a beginning of that sort of thought train, because again, I just went on the assumption of my Bible study conductor. These are apostate lies. They just want to draw you away. It's not true. And I embarked on my journey with Jehovah's Witnesses with that sort of assumption. So now you start to erode that assumption. Essentially, you start to wonder, well, what else do I not know about this organization? What else is not what I'm being told. So it kind of awakened my skeptical mind to sort of look at things with objectively and maybe with critical thinking and like that.
Fascinating. Yeah. I fantasize about the Bethel Library way more than I should. So you were living, you mentioned you were living in a 1-bedroom apartment with 4 other guys.
Yeah.
I happen to have in my collection, although I don't think it's right here with me now, a book title or a booklet titled Dwelling Together in Unity. Can you remember that book?
I remember the name. I can't remember the contents that well. I do remember that one, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was essentially, or it is, in fact, because I still have it today, a list of rules.
Yes.
And my first encounter with it was visiting the London Bethel with some friends in, I think, 1997. And we visited a friend of mine and went into his Bethel room. And I'll never forget one of my mates at the time who I think he'd driven us down there from Manchester. He was kind of sat on the sofa or the sofa bed, kind of avidly leafing through this book and kind of laughing at some of the rules. Yeah. And our friend who was a Bethelite was kind of desperately kind of trying to defend. Oh, no, that makes total sense. But it's one of those experiences where I think, the clues were there. It's a very, very controlled environment, isn't it? In terms of the rules that you have to live by.
Yeah. If, we're familiar with the rules that are just normal to a rank and file Jehovah's Witnesses, well, you can imagine that ramped up several levels of magnitude. Things like you couldn't wear sports clothes like shorts, and that if you were going to the recreation area, you were not to walk in a path that would cross one of the Bethel tour paths, because they didn't want you being in shorts in front of. Yes, it was like to that level of control.
I'm just imagining like a tour party and this kind of really buff Bethelite going past in his gym attire with his sweatband, his 80s sweatbands on and everything.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be funny. Yeah, they didn't want that situation. So, okay.
Yeah.
And there was the open door policy as well, famously.
I'm
so
not sure.
You had to have your door open at all times if there was a member of the opposite sex.
Oh, yes.
In the room. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's funny. So every floor in Bethel had 2 or 3 housekeepers that were responsible for those rooms. And if if you ever had, because I dated a girl while I was at Bethel, and I ended up marrying her. And I recall the housekeeper making several passes by the room, innocuously perhaps, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were just trying to, who's he seeing now? Just sort of feeding the rumor mill.
Well, if I'm imagining myself as a Bethelite, because a lot of the kind of culture and the rules are still in existence today. Yes. We're talking about things that Bethelites watching this video, and almost certainly there's going to be some Bethelites, I would imagine. Yeah, they're going to be nodding along thinking, yeah, that's how it is today. And if I'm imagining myself as a Bethelite, I would be absolutely terrified of the housekeepers, because you hear of all sorts of stories of a housekeeper kind of finding a book or a magazine or a CD or a video game that is quote unquote worldly or in some way incriminating. Did you come across any situations where a housekeeper would get one of your friends in trouble?
I've heard of several. And, part of the reason, just so viewers understand, is, you would wake up in the morning, you would go to morning worship, you would tidy your room, but it was cleaned, I think it was daily. Yeah, I think it was daily by your assigned, housekeeper for that floor. So every one of your personal items, drawers, wherever were available and open. And so, there were times where a housekeeper found an inappropriate magazine, perhaps pornography or any sort of issues like that. Housekeepers were on the front line of discovering that because they had access to everything that a Bethelite had in their room.
I guess in terms of porn, your best bet would be to curate your own kind of scrapbook of images from the organization's own literature that were a little bit raunchy. And then if you got Hall in front of a Bethel elder, you could just say, these particular articles were of interest to me, brother, and they're spiritual food. Right. It just so happens that they follow a theme, but it's all spiritual food, So
and music was a big thing. So your music collection was available, and I remember. Well,
Nat King Cole's safe. We've learned it's okay listening to Nat King Cole. We've learned from Samuel Hurd at the latest Gilead.
Yeah. But I remember. I think even my best friend got counseled because one of the CDs. Back then, you had CDs, right? One of the CDs that he liked to listen to contained a song with inappropriate language on it. And the type of music that you could listen to, it was a very, very, it was things that were very innocuous, like Sade or I don't know, just anything inappropriate was not allowed in your room. And so housekeepers would oftentimes go through your music collection sometimes too, apparently, because that's how some of the people I knew received counseling.
I think it would be really, really hard to have a taste in music and be a Bethelite because, to know that there's someone who can just go through your CDs or your tapes or whatever at any point, and not just that, but I would really struggle with the privacy aspect. I mean, knowing that any drawer or any surface can be rifled through at any moment, surely that was difficult to live with on a day-by-day basis.
It was, and it sort of reminded me of what it might be like to be in a military situation where you are essentially government property. Well, it felt very much the same. At least I think it does.
Sure. So then there was the whole toxic barrel situation, which again we talked about. So talk us through how you extricated yourself from that environment.
Well, I had mentioned to you when we last met that I think it was either you or your wife asked me, well, what was it that caused you to wake up? And it really, I can sum it up as a, death by 1,000 cuts. I had all these little episodes that sort of lead you in a certain direction. And that is, I always looked at my experience at Bethel and as a Jehovah's Witness in general. I always looked, is this an organization run by God, or is this, what would I expect to see if God was directing it versus if humans were directing it? And it always tilted over into humans are directing this. That's the impression you got. So being able to look behind the curtain at Bethel and sort of question their claims of being God's spokesman or a faithful and discreet slave, you had time to think about these things. I remember one of the things that was sort of impactful for me is when I considered they teach that they were part of a long line of faithful servants, faithful and discreet slave, responsible for spiritual food going all the way back to the time of the apostles. Well, when I was researching, I realized that the assembly of the Bible canon that we read, the 66 books that we call the Bible, was assembled by Catholic theologians in the 5th century. At the same time when supposedly there was this faithful and discreet slave who was responsible for spiritual food, we have an organization that Jehovah's Witnesses refer to as being run by Satan, perhaps doing the most important work ever.
Yeah. Of assembling the Bible.
Canon.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't really make sense now, does it?
Hmm.
And another thing, if the faithful and discreet slave was a long line of faithful, who did Pastor Russell receive it from? Who was the faithful and discreet slave that handed it off to Pastor Russell?
Hmm.
Well, the conclusion's obvious. He started his own movement. And so he had time to sort of think about those things while you were, closely interacting with an organization who supposedly has divine, direction acting upon it. So,
but what does it look like to? I mean, I kind of know what it looks like because I've literally boosted someone from Bethel, so I've seen how raw and emotional that situation is. But are we talking you go into your overseer's office and say I quit? In practical terms, what was going through your mind when you left, and how did you leave?
So the episode where I was had that exposure to the toxic waste issue was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm like, all right, well, I don't want to be a part of it here. And when you're thinking in that mindset, you tend to minimize it. Oh, well, that's just a certain brothers. It's not endemic in the organization, or you know what I mean. You're willing to give them the benefit of the doubt for quite a long time as you're unwinding, from the belief system. But it just became clear that that this wasn't the direction I wanted to go. I didn't go out in a blaze of glory. I didn't even stop participating as a Jehovah's Witness at that point. I left Bethel. I just said, me and my wife want to go home and raise a family, things like that, was an excuse to leave. There were other things I just left out of the conversation.
Sure.
But it wasn't
like you were kind of dishonorably discharged or there was any scene or anything. You just said, I've done my shift and I'm married now and
right.
Let's part ways. And it was all very amicable, was it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded that there's this sort of Damocles over your head at all times. And that is, if you fall out of favor with Jehovah's Witnesses, you lose your friends and family, and that everybody faces that worldwide. We see that happening worldwide, and I was facing it too. So you're not inclined to, just go out in a blaze of glory.
Sure. So, you'd had this experience that, the overwhelming majority of Jehovah's Witnesses don't get to have, where they come closer to kind of seeing the man behind the curtain and, being able to see, like you say, how man-made the organization is. And you go from that situation to kind of being a rank and file publisher, I guess. So talk us through that kind of transition. Yeah.
So, again, with that mindset where I'm like, okay, a lot of things are not adding up, I go back to the local congregations and, they're sort of wanting me to become an elder soon. I wasn't an elder at that time. I've been trying to avoid it during the last year of my Bethel experience because of some of the questions I was having, but it was even more intense when I was in the congregation. So I found a way to avoid it even longer. And that was to volunteer for international construction work. In general, I seem to remember an unwritten rule that you should be in the congregation so that the local brothers can observe you for a year or two before they will nominate you to be an elder. So by me only staying in there for 6 months and then taking an international job, I was able to sidestep that sort of pressure to become a Bethel elder, because I really had some serious reservations.
So you were essentially congregation hopping for a period. Yes. How long was this period?
Well, I landed in a congregation, and after about 6 months, I applied for, and received an invitation to work on the Venezuela branch that was being constructed. And so after 6 months, I was in Venezuela for 9 months, working on that project. And that took me out of consideration for an elder in that congregation I was in. And then, now I'm in the international construction, which is, it was fun. I wanted to travel. It was, I'm like, well, why not? I still had doubts at the time, but it was different. International construction is different. You're far away from the headquarters, and it's very easy to, it's much more relaxed than other parts of the organization. So it almost served as a little bit of a reprieve from the pressure cooker that I was in at Bethel. The pressure to become an elder when I left Bethel, it was almost like a mini vacation where all you had to do was focus on your work and the friends you had there.
I guess if I'm anticipating what my viewers might be thinking, some of them will be thinking, hang on a minute, you had doubts while you were becoming a Jehovah's Witness. Right. Those doubts were only affirmed when you were in Bethel.
Right.
You purposefully avoid becoming an elder because of these doubts in your religion. And now you're volunteering months, if not years, of your time to doing manual labor for an organization you have serious doubts about.
Yes, it's true. It's true. I guess
unpaid manual labor, I should add. It's not like you're getting a salary for it. Yeah.
But in my mind, I think I'm in my late 20s at that time. It was an adventure. You got to go to a foreign country and all expenses paid for, and you could work on, a second language. The position I was in was a machine operator, and I very much wanted to even get that experience. So it had some other benefits to it that made it more enticing.
Do you think there was an element still of not wanting to disappoint your parents? Because obviously there are other things that you can do as a young person that will allow you to travel and see the world other than work as an unpaid cult worker.
Yes, sure. Absolutely. That was a factor. Keep in mind, when you do leave Bethel, you don't have any resources. Like you don't have your network to get job. If you have a career network, you don't have that. You're kind of like starting over when you leave. So it was just easy. And, it was easier to do it that way and try to, arrange it yourself.
Okay. And so you're in Venezuela.
Yes.
And so how do we get from you in Venezuela building things for free for the organization to where we are today with you on an apostate video on an apostate YouTube channel, telling thousands of people every which way that it's a man-made organization that they shouldn't waste their time with? Right.
Well, so in the international work, as I alluded to, it's a lot less intense than at Bethel, and even less intense than if you're just a regular congregation goer. Nobody's really paying attention that you're going to a meeting or doing some sort of function every single day. Like they like to keep you busy. So it was a way to, I don't know, it was a way for me to reflect a little bit, to step back and assess things even more so than I was before. And it is a slow process. For some people, I think, they can make a decision that this is not for them and they leave straight away. At least for me, it was a slow process of unwinding from, what I've been taught and the claims and stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. You would think that it would be as simple as just kind of having some kind of epiphany or revelation and thinking, right, that's it, I'm done, I'm out the door. But when you're raised in it and there are expectations being placed on you, and it's all you've ever known, and this is your entire social circle, those factors can lead to you staying in much, much longer. than perhaps you should. So,
Mhm. And so, and just keep in mind, so that roughly we're looking at about a year to a year and a half after leaving Bethel. And then by the end of that time period, I knew I was completely done. So even while working an international project, I was still unwinding myself from the belief system. So I'd say the time period it took me to fully just disengage was about it was a 2-year project.
and when you say disengage, do you mean kind of deprogram? So
Yeah.
by the end of that 2 years, you were, would we say PMO? You were physically in, mentally out. So you'd realize that it wasn't true and you were going to try and fade. Was that the situation?
So after international construction, at that point, I made a concerted effort to fade.
Sure.
Without being sanctioned, without being disfellowshipped. I just knew it wasn't for me. I knew there was a lot of things that just were not true, could not be explained, and no matter how hard you tried. So yes. And then when you assess your life at that point, you're like, well, if I take a stand against this and I, go public with it, I will lose all my friends and family. So I don't really want to do that. So I'll just quietly drift away. I moved away from my hometown, which made things easier. And then I was fully disengaged.
But you had, and now we're going to have to come back a little bit to the toxic waste issue, because you were still effectively, shall we say, PMO or physically attached to the organization when you were essentially whistleblowing with the authorities. So,
well, that occurred several years after Bethel.
Sure.
After I was well into my fade.
Sure. But was that stressful for you, knowing that if your identity were to be made public, or if your name were to be attached to the information you were bringing to the authorities' attention, that things could go badly for you in terms of your relationships? Absolutely.
And that was a condition of my reporting, is that I need this to be kept anonymous because I do fear retaliation.
And that was actually, I'm trying to think now, because at some point this kind of dovetails with my activism work, because again, I remember very vividly the story breaking about the report and the fact that the organization had this issue of toxic waste not being correctly managed, and that there was someone who was behind it, but the identity was unknown. And I even did a blog article on it as one of the first blog articles I did for then JW Survey. But then it was only what was it, 22nd? Well, the interview went up on the channel 22nd of September 2021. So it was quite some years later that you felt like comfortable enough to actually go on camera.
Right.
And talk us through that journey. Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind, just going back to the episode of the toxic waste, I didn't have complete information of the entire issue, but as time went on, I realized, wow, they didn't report the full, the full story. There was no cleanup effort. I was maybe thinking, holding out hope that they were going to do the right thing. Well, after a couple of years, you realize, no, they're trying to bury this. So it was a slow realization, combined with, at that point, I fully knew that this was not the true religion that they claimed it to be. So I felt confident in going forward. There was no uncertainty anymore. And, but it took a few years for me to reach out and say, hey, I think there's an issue that did not get dealt with. So,
but so then, and by the way, I think it took enormous bravery for you to do that. And it speaks a lot to your integrity to say, this is serious. We're talking about the environment. We're talking about, the water catchment area and the contamination of land and water and natural resources. And this can't be allowed to just go completely untreated. Right. So for you to address that issue was really, really brave. But it's another thing entirely for you to, come to Croatia as you did and sit down with me and, attach your face to all of this.
Right.
And, as we said at the beginning, it's had benefits because people have reached out to you and found it, useful for their own deprogramming. But, what led to you feeling comfortable to do not only that interview, but this interview?
It's interesting. And I've observed this in some of your sort of hidden camera interviews with Jehovah's Witnesses. We see that when they approach someone as a prospective convert, it's very much whitewashed. They don't tell you the entire story. They let you sort of get involved before they realize, before you realize, oh, there's this disfellowshipping. There's all these things that could negatively affect your life. So for me, in my mind, it's like, if you know that there is a bridge out just down the road and you see traffic heading that way, and there's no signs or anything to warn you, you're going to do everything you can to stop traffic. You don't want somebody, driving off the bridge. So I felt that way very much about the way witnesses portray their beliefs. They like to definitely hide and whitewash and gloss over some of the more, cruel aspects of their religion when it comes to the shunning. The blood policy, they don't like to be upfront with that with a new convert. There's a lot of things they want to suppress. And I think it's, for me, I think people need to be fully informed about what they're getting into, because it has powerful ramifications on someone's life if they join this religion, whether it's how they behave towards their family, or if their family ends up joining a religion, how their family may treat them if they change their mind. There's things that I think people need to know.
Are you still on good terms with your believing family, if it's not too personal to ask?
No. They've there was some presentation or talk at a convention that says, well, if someone is clearly not, or if they're living the life of someone who should be disfellowshipped, then treat them that way.
Yeah.
And that's, so they wrote me a letter essentially saying that. And
who your parents did?
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So your parents sent you a letter saying, we're going to shun you.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was that like to receive?
I wanted to convey to them that, you're making a serious decision here. I don't know if they fully understood the ramifications, but if you're willing to, in my mind, if you're willing to discard a member of your own family, especially as a father now, I have children, the idea that you're going to disown them, that's a very serious thing. And for me, they're really, I don't want to say there's no going back, but that is not something that's going to ever escape my notice in life. If they change their mind in the future, don't expect me to be there. You abandon your family. You abandon your family for a magazine company that you won't even do basic independent research on. So for me, that leaves an indelible impression.
Yeah, I kind of relate to that. That's kind of, and fair enough. Some people take a slightly different view. Ultimately, Jehovah's Witnesses aren't in control of their own minds. But I think, especially as a father myself, I just cannot excuse shunning your child because they have different ideas to you, especially if they're, it's not like they're doing it to offend or to just cause needless outrage. They are sincere. They have sincere doubts. They are taking a conscientious stand. They're living true to themselves and to their principles. No way can I justify shutting someone out. Yeah.
And the religion has such far-reaching effects that I very much felt a responsibility to be the firewall between that side of my family who has this very toxic religion with these cruel policies, and then my kids, that no one's getting through that wall. So that sort of crystallized my, I don't know, I guess the way I feel about my family now that they wanted to cut me off. Well, okay, that's fine. I have already rebuilt my life, rebuilt my friends, my family. You cannot harm me. You're only going to harm yourself. And you are not getting anywhere close to my family with this, with this sort of philosophy, as religious philosophy.
Good for you. Good for you. I do have one more question, but before we get to that, I think it's just worth flagging that, before you came on air, I asked you to look at the current list of governing body helpers to see whether you could identify any of the names on the list from your time. And, obviously a number of years have passed and, you were in Wallkill and not necessarily in contact with governing body members and helpers. However, you did remember the name Troy Snyder, who is currently one of only 3 helpers on the coordinators committee.
At the time I was at Wallkill, Lon Schilling was the director of the farm, the Watchtower Farms, the Wallkill facility, and Troy Snyder was his assistant. So, I would see him. I actually sat at the same table as Lon Schilling. And so, anyways, I would see Troy often. It's just interesting to see that he's now a helper.
Well, he's not just a helper, he's on the coordinators committee, which until very recently only had John Ekron as a helper. And now it has John Ekron, Troy Snyder, and Paul Gillies. So, the coordinators committee, it has a kind of a far-reaching remit, shall we say, based on your experience, just adding to what we discussed in the toxic waste video. Would you say that Troy Snyder has first-hand knowledge of the cover-up of toxic waste at Wallkill?
Well, I can't read his mind, but I know his brother, Darren, was very much side by side with me in this matter. So, yes, I can't see how he would not.
Difficult to imagine his brother keeping it from him. Yeah. Okay, that's fair. And one final question, which I ask everybody who comes on the channel, especially those who are ex-members of any cult. What would be your advice to a Jehovah's Witness, or perhaps someone on the fence who is having doubts about their beliefs, but fears ramifications if they go down the path of doing independent research?
I've seen different videos by the governing body and members of the society saying your faith is not strong enough to consider this information that either apostates or opposers have. And I will say that's absolutely true. This religion does not stand up to scrutiny. So my advice, and this might seem a little unconventional, but my advice to someone who is a Jehovah's Witness and has these questions is, if you want to remain a Jehovah's Witness, only listen to what they say. Do not do any research. Do not do any independent research at all or any independent thinking. Don't dig because you won't like what you find. If you want to remain a Jehovah's Witness, absolutely only listen to them, because I don't know. It's just clear why they're so paranoid of people learning the truth about the truth. Yeah, the picture it paints is just quite clear. They're not evil people, but they certainly aren't. They certainly don't have a special audience with God. That is clear when you do your independent research.
Very well said. And if you don't mind me saying, when you say "don't dig," it's very poetic, the metaphor there, given your story with the toxic waste.
Right.
There's definitely a metaphor in there somewhere. So, William, it's been an absolute pleasure having you back on the channel. Thank you for adding more to your story. I'm sure it will be of enormous benefit to viewers.
Well, good. That's what I hope for.
So viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this interview. Don't forget that you can watch similar interviews by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching.